Hi, welcome to this short lecture entitled Two Core Realities of Cybersecurity. What we're going to do is talk about our irreversible reliance on cyber systems and on data, and also talk about our growing risk. In a lot of ways, I think you probably already know this or you wouldn't be in this class, but it's always helpful to remind ourselves of these ground truths. One, we are so reliant on systems and data. And two, these systems and data are vulnerable and under constant attack. And throughout this lecture, we're going to look at some statistics that really help us support and understand these two statements, these two truths. And of course, because we're so reliant and on systems and data that are vulnerable and under constant attack, to us, and I'm sure to you, or you wouldn't be here, cybersecurity is not optional. Trust must be earned. Must be earned. That's a key word. And it must be protected. So we know that digital systems power nearly every aspect of our modern life. It's no longer a convenience, it's a necessity, right? Some people would say that we live in a digital civilization. So let's consider a few facts. Financial systems. If we look in 2000, 3% of global commerce was digital. Today it's over 60%. $9.1 trillion in global digital payments in 2023. And look at the growth projected to reach almost 14 trillion by 2026. US credit card fraud losses rose from 1.5 billion in 2001, 24 years ago, to 7 billion in 2022. The New York Stock Exchange processes over 1 billion digital messages a day, right? So you can look at that, you can say, I see. So it's really global trust in our financial infrastructure and our financial systems. Well, let's look at another important industry sector, transportation and logistics. Modern cars contain 100 million lines of code. Over 100,000 daily flights rely on digital systems. 90% today of shipping is digitally coordinated compared to 10% in 1999. GIS usage in logistics companies rose from less than 25% in 2010 to more than 85% in 2023. So just stop for a minute and appreciate all of the things that we rely on in the supply chain for our livelihood, for our food, for our products, for our goods, just to have a viable, ongoing existence. Healthcare systems, another important infrastructure. In 2001, electronic health record adoption was less than 20%. Today, greater than 95%. 50% plus of our medical devices are network connected. And then we can think about not just in doctors' offices and not just medical devices perhaps implanted in patients. Telehealth, that's a much broader population. Telehealth surged from 11% to 46% during COVID-19, and I believe it's remained pretty high. It's now considered, to be standard practice. So when systems fail, lives and livelihood can be jeopardized. Energy and infrastructure. It's evening. I'm sitting here delivering this lecture to you with the benefit of lights and air conditioning. Smart grids were experimental 25 years ago. but by 2032, the smart grid market is expected to reach over $100 billion. Smart grids. 595 exajoules of energy digitally managed in just 2022. And our energy infrastructure is a top cyber attack target. So when these systems fail, blackouts, failures, that could be catastrophic just in any one infrastructure. And of course, what you have to think about, which we had the scenario, what you have to think about is what if some of these infrastructures failed concurrently? And society's digital backbone, right? What makes health systems, what makes financial systems, what makes transportation and logistics go? Well, it's that digital backbone. So in 2000, there were 400 million internet users. Today at 5.3 billion. Internet traffic will exceed 5.9 zettabytes this year. IoT devices, 30 billion expected by 2030, up from 500 million in just 2003. And then you can see the statistic here on the cloud spend. So this course is about trustworthy systems and how we build and operate trustworthy systems. But these statistics are why we need trustworthy systems and data. And so I also mentioned that, these systems are vulnerable and they're under constant attack. And this is a picture of Willie Sutton, the bank robber. Why rob banks? Well, because that's where the money is, he said. And so you might be thinking to yourself, well, why attack digital systems? And a lot of people, I think, tend to think, well, I don't have anything of value. They probably don't want my identity. They probably don't want my personal protected information. But everything that I just mentioned, our financial health, our physical health, our transportation, logistics health, our society's digital backbone, that's where the value is. And so attackers follow the value. Bank robbers yesterday are not that different from bank robbers today. So let's look at some numbers, some stats that will help us see the growth in cyber attacks. US data breaches in 2005, 136. By 2021, that was up to 1,862, a 13 times 13 increase in 16 years. Supply chain attacks up 742% since 2019. Credential-based breaches in 2019, 65% of breaches involved stolen credentials, up to 80% in 2023. Our federal government, incidents, attacks against our federal government rose from a little over 30,000 in 2022 to 31,500 in 2023. More indicators of risk, right? Phishing sites up in 2022, from 2022 to 2023. Look at this second bullet, the cybercrime cost, 639 billion in 2017, projected for this calendar year that we're in to go up to 10.5 trillion. We can quantify cost just by looking at the average cost of a data breach. 4.45 million for a single data breach in 2023, up to 4.88 million in 2024. This last bullet kind of cracks me up. It's the one place where there's a small ray of sunshine because ransomware payments are actually going down a little bit. But I think that's because people are getting smarter about recovering from ransomware and working with law enforcement and refusing to pay it or to recover some of it even afterwards. So, stats are interesting. They always tell you big trends. But when you look up close behind each number, there's a real world consequence, right? There's a failure that disrupted people's lives, that affected businesses, compromised businesses, perhaps weakened our infrastructure. And so I think it's always helpful to not just look at the statistics, but to dive down and look at the details in case studies. So let's look at 4 case studies quickly before we close this lecture out. Here's the first one. It's Equifax. It happened in 2017. And up here is a description of the incident meant to be this arc right here, the attack. Right, so hackers exploited a vulnerability in the Apache Struts framework. It allowed them to gain access to Equifax's systems. 147 million people had their data stolen. It included social security numbers, birth dates, addresses. So it wasn't just a system breach. It was also classified as a data breach. So if we think a little bit, we were just looking at the cost of data breaches on the last slide. So we can look a little bit at the short-term impacts. The breach settlement ended up being around $700 million, right? And it caused some concern. It made clear that organizations are not just stewards of systems, but they're stewards of trusted, private, sensitive data. But what I always think is interesting to think about is not just what the cost was of a particular breach or a particular attack, but kind of the long-term effect on trust, right? That long tail. And so what we saw from Equifax is consumers becoming more skeptical of sharing personal information online, as well as the call for stronger regulation, things such as GDPR. And, regulation is good up to an extent, but regulation can also be expensive. It can be hard to enforce. And some people, view it as being a real damper on innovation and growth. WannaCry, also an attack that happened in 2017, was a global ransomware attack. It affected about 200,000 computers. That was in 150 countries. And the impact of WannaCry, very different from the impact of Equifax that we just talked about, was across many sectors. Victims included hospitals, businesses, banks, manufacturers, government agencies. And the impacts really varied by sector. In healthcare, it did lead to disrupted medical services and delayed surgeries and locked out patient records. In finance, internal systems were affected, online banking was affected. In the manufacturing sector, production lines were halted. And in the government, it led all the way to operational delays in areas such as law enforcement. The damages were estimated between 4 and 8 billion. And if we look at the long tail again, we can appreciate that this attack caused significant anxiety about the vulnerabilities in widely used software that many organizations rely on. And it also really shone a spotlight on the readiness of institutions to defend against evolving cyber threats. Did shine a spotlight on the importance of timely software patching, but that continues to be a challenge to this day. Thorough and consistent and just plain old timely software patching. SolarWinds, many of you have probably heard of the SolarWinds attack, a little more recent, a 2020 attack. This is an interesting one. It was a supply chain attack. Hackers compromised the software supply chain. SolarWinds is a company that provides IT management software. And what they did is it put malicious code into the updates. We were just talking about patching, talking about timely patching, but effective patching is making sure that your patch is clean. So malicious code into the update for the SolarWinds Orion software was downloaded by thousands of organizations who were trying to do timely and effective patching. And it did allow the attackers to access system data that determined configurations, permissions, and network relationships, network trust relationships that have been negotiated. So in the short term, this breach gave hackers access to highly sensitive systems in the US government, in Fortune 500 companies, and also in the critical infrastructure sector. And then the hackers used that, and they managed access and monitored activity and controlled internal operations. SolarWinds was particularly damaging. It was pretty high profile. It shone the light on how even trusted vendors can be a vector for cyber attacks. It promoted, I think we all knew that supply chains were vulnerable, but really promoted the visibility about the integrity and the security of supply chains and third-party software. And, later in this course, we're going to talk a little bit about the secure software development life cycle. And in Module 3, we talk about software vulnerabilities. So this is foreshadowing some of the information that's going to come up. And this is the last one, which is the Colonial Pipeline ransomware attack from 2021. This pipeline is a fuel pipeline in the US on the East Coast. It was another ransomware attack. They locked down operations and then they encrypted the operational data that the pipeline needed, not just to produce fuel, but to safely transport it and to track it. And so the Colonial Pipeline was unable to verify flow rates, routing, or safety conditions. So short-term impacts, gas shortages, price hikes, disruptions to the energy sector. Colonial did pay a ransom. The FBI was able to recover some of it. And I think that this attack really helped us understand and appreciate the importance of cybersecurity in our critical infrastructure sector. We really started to understand this is a sector that needs high availability. We need to be able to rely on these systems to produce what they produce for people's livelihoods. So what we want you to take forward as you move into this next section of the course, and I think you're actually going to do an exercise next. We want you to practice thinking about what was the incident, what was the attack. We want you to think about what impacts did that lead to in the short term? And then what's the long tail effect, the long-term effect on trust? And we hope that by thinking through and connecting this chain of reasoning, you're able to always keep in the forefront of your mind why cybersecurity matters. So we'll close out the lecture and you can go on to the exercise.